Welcome back, honors. All right, so we are going to need to kind of buckle up for a little bit of a longer flip. And is that going to be okay? Yes, it's going to be fine, right? Because I'm not going to see y'all for like a bajillion days, all right? So, but anyway, you're going to have plenty of time to get this done. Also, a quick reminder, you're going to have a map quiz when you come back the next class period, and it is going to be based off of the Balkan area and then also the countries in and around Europe that we've already gone over, all right? So we're just going to kind of be expanding into the Balkan region of Europe, and we're going to be going over a couple of other ones that we've already gone over, including Crete and some of the other areas surrounding the Mediterranean, all right? So just remember, you have map quiz coming up. You need to go ahead and get ready for that. It's not very hard, as you know, to just get ready for a map quiz. And then going into it, we're going to need to get ready for, what else are we getting ready for? Well, actually, that should be pretty much it right now. But let's go ahead and pick up where we left off on in class, right? And where we left off in class, we were reviewing the Minoans and the Myceneans very heavily, right? We went over all that stuff. We talked about why I hate it when y'all get quiet, and you know, like we went over and engaged in a lot of little different odds and ends and items about the Minoans and the Mycenaeans. So to understand really quickly also the theory that we believe that the Mycenaeans probably lived in harmony and peace with the Minoans about 1500 BC, give or take, when a lot of historians have leading arguments that following the eruption of Mount Thera, the Minoans may have been taken over by the Mycenaeans, and that may have been the original piece of conquest by the Mycenaeans, and they may have begun to expand their territory throughout the area known as the Balkans, right? So they're going to begin to expand. So this is showing traits of that Mycenaean idea that we've already talked about a little bit, right? We talked about loosely about how the Mycenaeans seem very warrior-like, how in their Shaftgrave era they had the boar tusk helmets and several other bronze swords and some other equipment. We also then talked about how as they began to advance forward, military seemed to be a very prevalent part of their society. Now, that's, though, however, just because you're militaristic does not mean that you're not intelligent, right? Because, again, in the Quine era or the beehive burial period, we're going to see frescoes pop up, and we're going to see beehive burial chambers pop up. But we're also going to see the origins of Mycenaean writing during this time period as well. Linear B is the type of writing that they're going to use. Now, we believe that this is derived from Linear A and actually is going to be mushed together with the phonetic alphabet from the Phoenicians, and it's going to translate or kind of create the basis for the modern-day Greek language, right? So Linear B, actually, ironically enough, we can translate quite a bit of it, and we believe that it's the foundation of the modern Greek language, and it shows symbols and similarities between the Greek alphabet that the Phoenicians would actually culturally diffuse into the Greek area. Now, so this actually is a piece of Linear A, or excuse me, no, Linear B itself. So it's an amazing thing to understand that the Mycenaeans are actually pretty intelligent, right? And they are going to have a height, and they're even going to create large-scale architecture just like Knossos for the Minoans, right? Because at the height of the Mycenaean period, they're going to create a massive military stronghold known as Mycenae, right? I know it's not the most creative name on the planet. Like, Knossos is a good name, and they had a whole myth about it and everything else. But Mycenae is still going to serve as a very, very good emblem of the Mycenaean culture, and it's also going to show the elements of shaft-grave burial periods during the early period. It's also going to show the defensive strategies that a militaristic society would adopt, right? So when we're looking at it, you got to first understand that it's a very large complex, right? Massive stronghold that's going to be home to a ruling body as well as control territory outside of it. Because I'm sure some of y'all are probably asking yourselves right now, like Avon's probably asking, well, how is it possible that enough people that live inside of this small city-state could take over all that area in red that existed all over the map of Greece? Well, Avon, that's a good question, but this is kind of emblematic of a lot of city-states going forward. So just because you have a wall around your city-state, that means it protects two people, the leaders and the wealthy, right? The poorer people and a lot of your military are going to live outside those walls in areas and villages and towns around it. So it's not as if every single Mycenaean lived inside of this. But what we can see about Mycenae is we can see the military and stronghold tactics that a militaristic society would use, including walls that are actually capped with walkways for archers or other defenders to be able to walk around. We also can see subset areas of the stronghold, including the ruling hill up here, as well as some of the wealthier homes there. But here as well is really important. that itself is one of the shaft grave burial chambers. So this would have been one of the oldest parts of the city, and it would have expanded off of that. We can also see later a very, very important element of Greek architecture, that the more important buildings are elevated off of the, well, not off the ground, but elevated further up on a hilltop, right? That's going to come up really, really important here in a few minutes, right? So now this is something really interesting as well, is the symbol of the strength of the Mycenaeans. This bad boy is known as the Lion's Gate. Now, I know some of y'all are probably like, wow, this thing doesn't look that big. It looks kind of like a small hole. Well, if I were to take, like, I don't know, liqueur and stand her right here, she would only come up about a quarter of the way up. It's a massive, massive entryway and huge, and it is the only way in or out of the city-state known as Mycenae, right? And that entrance is known as the Lion's Gate, right? So, again, very, very good symbol of the military strength of the Mycenaean people, right? And as we can see right here towards the late Bronze Age, right, we can see the other empires that existed in duality with the Mycenaeans. We can see right over here the Arzawa, we can see right over here the Hittites, the Assyrians are popping up over here, the Babylonians, who we have talked about before, the New Kingdom Egyptians are right here. So this is really important to kind of step back and understand, is that we talked about the Egyptians, the New Kingdom Egyptians. We talked about the Hittites. We talked about the Assyrians. We talked about the Babylonians. We talked about all these other major empires. The Mycenaeans were there. The Greeks were around during the unit that we were just previously finished up with, that you just recently took your test on, that y'all actually knocked out of the park, right? So this is really important to know, that the Mycenaeans are going to come into contact with some of these other empires. They're going to trade with the New Kingdom Egyptians. They're going to trade with the Hittites. But they're also going to get into wars with some of them, right? Now, the biggest war that we know about Mycenaean history definitely has to be the war with Troy, right? Or the Trojan War. Now, the war with Troy, we believe, is going to also start a very, very important part of ancient Western civilizations in total, the Trojan War epic cycle, right? And what I mean by the Trojan War epic cycle is that not only is is major events in Greek history going to be related to this Trojan War in Mycenaean Greece, but also even the founding of Rome 700 years later is going to be related to the Trojan War itself as well. So, understandably so, it's not going to be what the myth talks about. The Iliad by Homer, which we'll talk about here in a few minutes, definitely has its foot in the idea that, oh, Agamemnon was the king of the Mycenaeans, and his brother was the king of Sparta, and he acquired Helen of Troy, the most beautiful woman in the West, and da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and then she strikes off with Paris of Troy, and then they run away, and then Agamemnon and his brother and Achilles go get her, and blah, 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 blah. Now, that didn't actually happen, okay? We believe that the actual Trojan War began as a feud with the Hittites, right? The Hittites were existing over in the east and were a growing major militaristic power that are going to take over the New Kingdom Egyptians and that are going to cause a lot of strife with a lot of these other large empires in the Mediterranean area. Now, the thing about it, though, is because the Trojans would not pick a side to ally with, the Mycenaeans viewed that as they were going to ally with the Hittites eventually. So more than likely, the Mycenaeans just wanted control over the trade routes throughout the Aegean, not necessarily chasing down a beautiful woman, right? And we believe that the Mycenaeans and a coalition of Greek states that they had already taken over besieged Troy because they thought that they were going to align with the Hittites, right? And when I say besieged, I mean besieged. They destroyed it and completely eradicated the city all the way down to the bricks and mortars and the foundational stones. Now, of course, the story you know involves a really big wooden horse, right? Of course, the story that you know of already, you're like, oh, isn't this the one where, they thought that this big horse thing was going to be left out front, and then the Trojans thought it was a gift, and the Mycenaeans left, and then a bunch of Mycenaeans popped out of it and killed all the Trojans and then destroyed everything? Yeah, that didn't happen either. Now, we have a lot of evidence that this idea of a story existed during this time period. Like the Athenians would have thought the Trojan horse was real, but we have found zero archaeological evidence that actually associates the fact that the Trojan horse itself was ever actually a real thing. Now, but it is important to know that the Trojan War is going to serve as a key focal point of art, literature, and historical growth from the perspective of Western civilization, right? So going forward, you're going to see the Iliad, right? And the Iliad is all about the story I was just talking about. King Agamemnon chases after Paris of Troy to go get this woman back, and then, oh my God, what is Paris' brother's name? Paris has a brother that like fights Achilles and dies out front of the city walls. Maria, do you remember what Paris of Troy's brother's name is? You know the Iliad? You know Paris is the guy from Troy, right? Runs off with Helen. Paris has a brother that, like, squares off with Achilles out front of the Trojan, like, what? You're killing me. Neither one of us can seem to remember this thing. But anyway, so Paris of Troy, brother. All right. Hector, that's what it is. All right, so Hector of Troy, la 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 la. All of these characters are involved in that famous story by Homer, right? Now, then there would be a second chapter of this story, also a Greek story, known as the Odyssey, which is the tale of Odysseus and his journey home following the Trojan War that he fought in, right? So, also by Homer. Now, interestingly enough, though, important thing to understand is that Athens and Sparta didn't exist yet when the Trojan War actually started. So, Homer obviously doesn't know what the heck he's talking about, right? So, but we're going to get into why that is here in a second, and why there's some kind of historical mix-ups in this story. Now, these two that are highlighted in red are Greek stories. This green one right here is a Roman story. And a Roman poet by the name of Virgil is going to write a story called the Aeneid, which is actually a story of Aeneas, the last surviving Trojan, and how apparently he went off and he founded Rome, right? So it's important to kind of understand, basically in a nutshell, how epic literature did surround a very real historical event, even though, ironically enough, the stories that followed weren't necessarily true. Now, then you're going to see a massive collapse, right? So, a lot of us, we don't know why the Minoans fell. We don't even know why the Myceneans fell. But we have some theories, right? But funny enough, no one knows really what happened at all. But right around, write this down, this is one of the only important dates you need to know for my class, 1200 BC, okay? So 1200 BC, right around then, the Bronze Era came crumbling down, right? The Bronze Age just collapsed. And it's literally known as the Late Bronze Age collapse. And no one is sure why it happened. No one is sure why the great empires of the Hittites, the Egyptians, the Myceneans, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, why all of these people just kind of went and why they actually fell. Some people argue it could have been climatological shifts. Some people argue it could have been invasions by other migratory groups. Some people argue it could have been pestilence. Some say it could have been famine. Some say, but no one truly knows why. But we do know around 1200 BC, all of these major empires are going to collapse, right? So the big thing, though, is that we believe in the Mycenaean theater, the reason why they collapsed, or something that happened in conjunction with the collapse, definitely is really important that you understand that a group of people known as the Dorians showed up, right? So the Dorians were a nomadic invading group of people who had no idea how to smelt bronze, as evident by this Doric cup that is actually symbolized right there. That bad boy looks nothing like the gold cup we looked at from the Minoans. This thing looks like a crumbly piece of junk that you made when you were in like 4th grade that for some reason your dad still drinks coffee out of, right? So we believe, though, that the Mycenaeans were destroyed by a class of people that only knew how to create crumbly-looking like clay cups, right? Known as the Dorians. What a Roman would refer to a Dorian as is a barbarian. So a barbarian or an invading group of people that did not speak the common language, but they did show up and eventually later on would adopt the Greek language and begin to call themselves Hellenes, which would later be translated as the very first Greeks or Greeks, right? So the Dorians showed up and they caused a massive amount of dysfunction and led to what is known as the Dark Ages, right? Now we're moving, so we have just successfully navigated the Neolithic period, the Early Bronze period, the Minoan period, the Mycenaean period, now we're in the Dark Ages, right? But really, really quick, let's describe a Dark Age. And I have a couple of little key things up here that describe Dark Ages, right? Dark Ages are defined as famine, no art, limited technology, limited artifacts, no history being recorded, no reading and writing, or in a nutshell, Dark Ages are terrible. Some philosophers from the Renaissance period in the 1400s AD of Europe are going to refer to the Middle Ages as the Dark Age because people couldn't read as well as they could later on, or there wasn't art produced as well as it was later on, or the economy was stagnant. So a dark age is bad. It's a terrible, terrible time period. And the Greeks are going to experience one when the Dorians show up and the Bronze Age collapses. Now, the thing about it, though, is we only have slim picking records from it. And when I say slim pickings, I mean nothing. The only records, quote unquote, that we have are oral records, right? And oral records are completely non-written and have just been stories passed along through people from generation to generation until somebody actually finally sat down and decided to record it, right? And the biggest one that we know of course, is Homer, and the second one is Hesiod, or Hesiod, or I can't ever say some of these people's names. I call them Hesiod all the time, but I know I'm not saying that right. But I think it's like Hesiod, something like that. But anyway, so Homer's the easy one to say. Homer is the guy that came up apparently with the Iliad and the Odyssey, right? Now, interestingly enough, he never once wrote these things down. Why did he ever write these stories down? Because he's blind, right? So he's apparently a wandering blind storyteller that walked from town to town, guided by some kid, all right? Like some boy would apparently serve as his guide and walk and show him around from town to town, and he would tell his stories. And his stories were mainly the Iliad and the Odyssey, right? Now, these stories did not get written down in his lifetime, and they would later on be written down saying, and everybody would be like, oh, the blind poet known as Homer is the one that told these stories. We're not even sure if Homer was real. We don't have any records of Homer actually being in existence, but then again, he appeared during a time when no one knew how to read or write, so it's not like if we even knew where he was, someone would have been able to tell us. So, but regardless, if some teacher hands you an Odyssey book, and it says written by Homer, you could be like, this is debatable, all right? So, and you could just kind of give him a rough time. But then the other prominent figure right here, Hesiod, is very important because he actually apparently constructed the very first Greek poems that actually referred to the gods and goddesses, right? Which is the foundation of the Greek religion. The Myceneans did not believe in Zeus and Hera and Poseidon and Aphrodite. They didn't believe in them because they never had created them. But apparently this guy creates a lot of the Greek gods, and his poems serve as the basis for Greek mythology, right? Okay, so now that we have finished up the Dark Ages, right, and we talked about how we only have written records from Homer and Hesiod, and it's a really bad time, and nobody can read and write, blah, 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 we don't really have a lot to talk about with the Dark Ages. So now we're going to immediately move into what is known as Archaic Greece. And we're only going to spend about 10 more minutes of this flip talking, and whatever we have left over, we'll finish up in class, and it won't be that serious, right? We'll kind of move on with our lives. Now, the big thing about it, though, Archaic Greece is defined as such. Go ahead and jot this down. It is the rise to prominence of a common Greek culture as well as the rise in power of Athens and Sparta. All right, so now the first things we have to talk about, though, is that common Greek culture, right? So as we already know, when we talked about Greece, we know that geographic isolation is going to lead to unique structured city-states, right? We talked about how the Minoans and the Myceneans are not going to be very similar to each other, even though they would eventually adopt something you would refer to as a common language, right? We know that big thing, the Athenians and the Spartans are going to have the same language and the same religion, but they're not going to actually be around each other enough to have similar cultures, right? And that is going to be very, very prevalent later. So the only thing I need you to write before this is that remember, geographic isolation created different cultured city-states, right? Now, one thing that we do know that is going to create commonalities, though, beyond their culture, beyond everything else, and the reason why Spartans are going to have the same language and the same religion and the same things that the Athenians are going to have, a lot of it has to do with just common Greek cultures, cultural aspects that were set up during the Dark Ages, right? And going into the Archaic period. One of those common Greek cultural ideas is that the sea is extremely important and it provided a vital link for trade, right? Now, eventually, this will bring city-states into contact with each other, and eventually the Athenians would know who the Spartans were because of trade and trade negotiations. Now, ironically enough, Spartans claim they never traded. Now, that's impossible. There's no way that's possible. They would have had to trade to get certain key items. Now, the thing about it, though, going into it, a lot of this also could be due to other reasons. They could have taken over people, blah, blah, blah. But anyway, you do need to know that Archaic Greeks, including the Athenians, the Spartans, and the Thebians? The people from Thebes, Megara, Corinth, and all these other city-states that start popping up, they traded similar things. And the things they traded were things like olive oil, wine, eels, cheese, honey, and fine pottery, right? Now, olive oil being the biggest one they traded. Actually, in fact, at one point, the Athenian government told every single farmer that the only thing you're allowed to produce is olive oil, right? Because it was just like such a crucial item for preservation, cooking, and consumption as well for other communities, and olives really only natively grew in the Balkan area before, and so they had an embargo on this particular crop, right? Now, wine became a major factor as well. Eels, freshwater eels for meat consumption. Cheese, mostly made from goat's milk. Honey, and fine pottery. Honey actually is really interesting because the Myceneans actually learned how to domesticate bees. All right, so and then the Greeks, actually the Archaic Greeks, took it a step further and had entire areas where they would domesticate bees and harvest the honey, right? And fine pottery is going to be another big one as well later on. Of course, there is olive oil, there is wine and olives, and then some other later items we'll talk about as well. We'll look at some of this fine pottery here in a few minutes. Now, you're going to see cultural leaps in Archaic Greece as well. Now, every time you see a star, 9 times out of 10, that means it's like a title in your notes, okay? Now, this is a little bit of a janky Prezi that I made years and years ago that I've kind of just been altering as time has gone on. But just know that if you see a star, it means it's like a title, all right? So, but to keep going forward, because we only got about 6 minutes left, the Greeks are also going to, during the Archaic period, begin to coin money. This is an idea adopted from the Persians later on, right? And also adopted from several other empires. But apparently, according to historiography, the Persians were some of the very first people to introduce a money-based economy. Maybe not the first people to invent money, but they actually introduced a money-based economy, right? So the Greeks are going to begin to take precious metals like silver, gold, iron, or any other type of thing that could be broken down. Copper became a big one as well, and they would begin to coin money using a coin press. So it's a process where you would have this little press or a symbol on it, a stamp. You put it over top of a blank, which was one coin, and you smack it with a hammer, and then it would leave behind a print, and those things were all standard weights, so it was a standard unit of exchange, right? So they invented the very first Western money economy. The Archaic Greeks are also going to develop their very own alphabet, adopted based off the Phoenician alphabet. The big difference between the Phoenician alphabet and the Greek alphabet is going to be the fact that the Phoenician alphabet only had 22 letters and had absolutely no vowels. The Greeks are going to add vowels to it and adopt a Greek alphabet that would later on become the basis of the Roman alphabet and would later on become the basis of all Western alphabets outside of the Cyrillic alphabet, which is going to come because of, I think that's St. Cyril. But anyway, the big thing, though, going forward also is another monumentally important thing about Archaic Greeks, right? So again, these are commonalities between all Greeks. Even though Sparta and Athens used different cultural ideas or had different cultural ideas, they used the same language. They used the same alphabet. They coined money just like the Athenians did. They traded when they traded, if they traded the same kind of stuff, right? So the Archaic period is also going to see the development of a very large athletic event, right? So during the Dark Ages, while Sparta and Athens are being founded, the Archaic period officially starts with the very first Olympic Games, right? So jot that down. The beginning of the Archaic period is documented as the very first Olympic Games, right? So the Archaic period saw the development of these large athletic events, right? They weren't necessarily called the Olympics at the time, but they were officially the first ones were held at the base of Mount Olympus, right? And they were supposed to be athletic events that gave tributes to the gods, right? Now, the prize for winning was only pride and immortality, right? Apparently in an olive wreath, right? You would have an olive wreath on your head or a laurel wreath, and that would be given to you. But the big thing was it was pride for your city-state. It was bragging rights for your city-state, saying, Sparta, oh, we have the best boxer that anyone's ever seen. And that's actually true. That apparently a Spartan boxer who was also a cook, even though he must have been a slave then, also apparently won the boxing event several years in a row. And then apparently another Spartan cook apparently won the Pancreatron event, which is literally death wrestling, where the only way you can win is if the other dude submits or dies, right? So now, other interesting fact though about the very first Olympics, they were all majorly associated around track and field events, right? Discus, javelin. The very first Olympic event was just a foot race. Horse racing would be adopted later on as well. But the big thing that's interesting to all people that are immediately, some people have some red flags going off, and people in the class right now that I know for a fact, like Julia and Riley, and as well as Allie Tao, and, a couple of y'all are like, why is he naked? All archaic Olympic events were competed in the nude, right? So all archaic Olympic athletes had to be nude while they competed. So that meant it was naked discus, naked javelin, naked boxing. The most popular event was wrestling. So sorry to ruin your Labor Day weekend, but it's just true, all right? So You're also going to see an archaic development of art. So going back to the Naked Olympics, as you can see, this is actually red figure pottery. This is put on a plate, right? Now, archaic art is going to be very important, right? You're going to see the development of sculpture, and you're also going to see the development of black and red figure pottery during the archaic period, right? Like the one we just looked at. The Myceneans did not use black or red figure pottery. The Minoans did not. They perfected frescoes. Those things would kind of die out with the Minoans and the Myceneans and wouldn't really pop up again until the Roman era. Now, you are going to see sculpture, though. And sculpture, some of you are looking at this and you're like, well, this is kind of garbage. Well, the important part to look at it as, it is proportional. The human figure is proportional. The head and the body look as though they would on a normal human person. And also, the sculpture setting, the 1 foot forward is implying movement, right? It's implying that this figure would be taking a step forward, which is still a major advancement in art and art studies throughout the Archaic period. And this right here is a red figure pot showing on the outside a piece of mythological history, right? So even their pottery became things that they would record historic and myth-like events on the outside of. Now, this is red figure pottery. This is the more complex one to make. Black figure pottery actually came first because it would literally be black figures painted directly on top of a terracotta pot before it was actually kilned and fired. Now, red figure pottery, on the other hand, everything had to be painted in the negative, right? So this red figure is actually the clay shining through the glaze, and the black is painted on top, right? So red figure pottery did become a little bit more complex later on. We got one more thing to talk about, and then we're going to cut it off here, but it has to do with governing the city-states, right? So every single Greek city-state was known as a polis. Sparta had a polis, Athens had a polis, Thebes had a polis, Corinth had a polis, and when we really get into talking about Athens and Sparta, you got to understand that there's a buttload of other city-states out there, right? Tons and tons of other ones, but none of them were just as powerful or as dominant as those two. But every single one of them had what you would refer to as a polis, and the word polis literally refers to city. That word, root, polis, is actually present in a lot of English words, like metropolis, the huge city where Superman lives, right? Or necropolis, a very large burial city, or a graveyard is referred to as a necropolis, right? Necropolis. So the big thing about it, though, is the archaic Greek polis would be pretty consistent throughout all of the Greek city-states. And it consisted of two main parts. The first one was known as the Acropolis, or the high city that was built on a hilltop. Now, this hilltop high city contained all the huge marble temples dedicated to the different gods and goddesses that were patrons of that city. For example, a very famous building is built on the Acropolis of Athens, and you need to write this famous building down. It's the Parthenon, right? Parthenon. The Parthenon is built on the Acropolis of Athens, and we're going to look at a picture of that here in a second. Now, the secondary part of the city was the walled main city, right? It was below the Acropolis on flatter ground, and it was like inside of it was the marketplace known as the Agora, which is very important that we'll talk about here in a second. Theater, public buildings, and homes for the super wealthy, all right? So this right here, there we go, is a picture of the Athenian Acropolis, right? Located up here above everything on a higher elevated plane, and these are the ruins of the Parthenon that have been left behind. Now, this, of course, down here, looking down, is the remains of the lower walled city. But this is what we believe that Athens would have looked like at its peak. The Agora being located right here in the central area of the city, the Acropolis being located on the hilltop high side. Now, the marketplace, though, is really important. The Agora is the main important gathering place of all Greeks where they would meet to debate, talk, trade, and they even had festivals and special, like, for their gods and goddesses, right? Religious ceremonies. And one of the oldest agoras can be pictured right there. That is the Agora ruins of Athens, right? So we're going to stop right there. We're going to pick up on this stuff when you come back from Labor Day weekend. Remember, you're going to have a map quiz when we come back, so go ahead and start studying that stuff. I'm going to send an email out letting everybody know about that as well, so you can have a couple days to get ready for it. But I'll see you guys soon. Y'all have a good one.